Hello, my name is Richard Lang, and today I will tell you about work with David Rolnick and Conrad Cording on functional clusters in the hidden layers of artificial neural networks. Consider a feed-forward neural network that takes inputs X, processes them through a sequence of fully connected layers, and produces outputs Y. A common grievance against this kind of network is that it lacks structure. It's just a big pile of linear algebra, to borrow a phrase from XKCD. This is often contrasted to biological neural networks, where there are distinct anatomical areas that serve distinct functions. For instance, visual information is processed by separate what and where pathways. Such a separation of function into distinct processing modules is thought to facilitate learning, generalization, and interpretability, yet modularity itself is poorly understood. Past work on modularity in neural networks usually takes two approaches. Work on structural modularity operationalizes modules in terms of sparsity in the network weights. We take the second approach of functional modularity, where modules are defined by the role of hidden unit activations. This brings us to the first major question. How can we detect and quantify functional modules by looking at hidden unit activity? Our approach begins by selecting a layer of a neural network and quantifying the similarity of all pairs of units in a layer. Identifying modules then becomes a clustering problem of finding similar functioning units. Any set of cluster assignments can be assigned a modularity score, or Q, which was a metric originally designed to detect modular structure in network data. Intuitively, high Q means that units are significantly more similar within than across clusters. In other words, we should see higher values in the block diagonal parts of the pairwise similarity matrix after sorting by cluster. Now, a crucial step I skipped over is exactly how we define the functional similarity of a pair of units. We used a variety of different measures for pairwise similarity between units, and we placed them into two broad categories: input-oriented methods, which look at the similarity of hidden unit responses to changes in inputs, and output-oriented methods, which look at whether hidden units drive similar downstream changes. Our first input-oriented method is to simply measure the absolute value covariance between two units across items in the test set. Our second input-oriented method quantifies similarity based on sensitivity of the hidden units to fluctuations in input dimensions. Our first output-oriented method quantifies pairwise functional similarity using the absolute value of the Hessian of the loss for a particular task. And our second output-oriented method, like the first gradient method I described, looks at the dot product between two gradients, but now using the output layer of the network rather than the input layer. Finally, we considered a normalized version of each of these methods. Importantly, each of these methods for quantifying pairwise similarity between units corresponds to a different way of thinking about what it means to have modular functional structure in a network. We will ask two questions about these methods. First, how does each of these measures of modularity depend on regularization? And second, do these methods generally agree with each other? To answer these questions, we studied a simple feed-forward MNIST classifier with three fully connected linear layers. We will analyze the two layers of hidden activities H1 and H2. We trained 288 networks across a range of regularization values and seeds. Then, for each hidden layer in the trained network, we computed units pairwise similarity using the 8 methods described on the previous slide, then clustered the units by maximizing the modularity score, Q. This plot shows the average modularity score, quantified using the input side covariance measure of pairwise similarity as a function of regularization strength. We used three different types of regularization: L2 normalization on the weights, or weight decay, L1 normalization on the weights, and dropout after each layer. The gray shaded area shows the distribution of scores for untrained models. Now, if I show all 8 methods together, I can highlight a few salient features of the data. First, we see, surprisingly, that increasing dropout regularization has the biggest effect on modularity scores. Second, looking at L1 regularization, we only see an increase in modularity in a few cases, seemingly independent of whether the pairwise similarity was normalized on the input side, but crucially dependent on normalization on the output side. Let's briefly zoom in on the first set of dropout results for input side correlation measure of similarity. What we see is that increasing dropout indeed results in more block diagonal-like structure in the correlation matrix. In other words, units in each cluster are becoming more and more like identical or redundant copies of each other as we increase dropout. We began this analysis with 4 hypotheses, and it turns out we were wrong on nearly all accounts. We had hypothesized that L1 regularization should increase modularity via sparsifying connections, but this turns out to depend on how modularity is measured. We had thought that L2 regularization should have little effect on modularity since it's invariant to rotation, but it turns out that L2 regularization does increase modularity, although it was the weakest effect of the 3 types of regularization we used. Third, we had originally hypothesized that dropout should reduce modularity by spreading out the function of a layer over more units. It turns out this is wrong. Dropout led to higher redundancy, which made units more clusterable or more modular. Finally, we had anticipated few differences between the 8 different measures for quantifying modularity, but we ended up finding non-trivial and idiosyncratic interactions between this modularity measure and regularization. This leads us to the second question we started with, which is how well these methods agree with each other. To quantify this, we will ask whether different methods tend to assign units to the same clusters. As an example, look at what happens when we take pairwise similarity matrices measured using one input-oriented method and an output-oriented method, and then sort the units by the clusters given by the other method. We see the block diagonal structure is largely destroyed, which indicates that these clusters might be different from each other. We quantified alignment using this alignment score, which is a value between 0 and 1, which essentially counts the fraction of units assigned to the same cluster in each method by counting all possible permutations of clusters. This plot shows the average alignment score of clusters found by our 8 different pairwise similarity methods. The upshot of this analysis is that on average there is a low alignment between the input and output families of method for measuring pairwise similarity, and only minor differences depending on normalization. However, this is a rough summary plot averaging over the various regularization methods we used. In this plot, I split the cluster alignment analysis by regularization type along the rows and regularization amount on the columns. The difference between input methods and output methods remains fairly robust, but we can also see some secondary patterns emerge, which unfortunately I don't have time to dive into here. To summarize, we began with the question of what it means for a neural network to be functionally modular, and we introduced a method for quantifying modularity by clustering units based on pairwise similarity scores. We considered 8 different ways of measuring pairwise similarity corresponding to 8 ideas about what it means for a network to be modular. We found surprising and non-trivial dependencies between modularity and regularization in a simple model. And finally, comparing the clusters identified by each method, we found significant misalignment between modules measured by how clusters process inputs versus measuring how their outputs are used in downstream processing of the network. With that, thank you for listening to this flash talk. Thank you to the Neuromatch organizers, and thanks to the NSF for funding. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact me